Hi, everybody. Today, I'm excited to chat with Zoran Jambor, someone whose writings have been gracing my inbox for over 10 years. He is the writer of the very popular and influential newsletter, CSSWeekly. So in this chat, we talk about how he got started, what motivates him to keep writing on such a consistent basis, and a whole lot more. This is going to be a really fun chat, so stick around. Zoran, great to chat with you. I've been following your content across so many mediums for ages, so it's fantastic to kind of meet you in person and talk in real time. So I'd like to ask the question that I always like to start with is, how do you get started?
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I guess the way to get started is to just start doing stuff. And this is what I did. We had like a skateboard club and a band, and they needed a website. So I got into things, started exploring, and started working with HTML, CSS, and things took off from there. I found those things to be very interesting. I got really into it, and yeah, it eventually became my profession. So
Did you focus more on the design side of things or the programming side of things when you first
yes,
got
at the
started?
beginning I started as a designer, but then I got into HTML and CSS and PHP as well, and I kind of found myself in the front end section. That was where yeah, this is where I live.
It's funny because what you're mentioning about how you got started because you were either in a music band or in skateboarding, at least five other designers who I think are like extremely talented and very good have done sort of exactly the same way. There's something about the way your brain operates at that frequency, at that level, and especially skateboarding culture has always been about really good design as well. Whether it's actually the design of the merchandise or the skateboards itself, how you personalize your skateboard was in many ways like a real life version of like a MySpace profile from back in the day where your personality was exuded through it. And if you were a designer, you really had an opportunity of, you had like a pretty large canvas that people could see both sides of at various opportunities to kind of be like, this is who I am, and here's how I visually represent myself. That's actually really nice to see.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense because those tie really together all creative activities, and yeah, once you get into one, it just kind of naturally flows from one to another.
Exactly. The thought process is similar. How it gets output at the end, of course, varies. One it is like actually physical medium, others like
Yeah,
in digital form, but that's all this part of the same water flowing.
yeah, yeah.
Cool. And so how old were you when you started doing your first website and your first designs?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I don't really know. I guess it was probably 15 years ago, maybe like 25 or something like that. Maybe I'm off here, but something like that, I think.
Yeah,
So it was exactly at the time that I got into it when discussion was happening in our space, in the web development space, whether we should use tables or CSS for layout. And yeah, so at that point, I just got into it, and somehow CSS made more sense than tables for layout, which is, of course, correct solution.
yeah, which is actually really interesting because tables were the easiest way back then to make this work. And I don't remember if you ever did some
Yeah,
of these things, but to create rounded corners, for example, you basically create a table that was like almost like a 3 by 3 grid, and then you had these like tiny like angled images that you put in the
yeah,
corners
yeah.
to make it have that like nice rounded shape.
Oh, ridiculous. Like just
Yeah,
getting border radius property in CSS was revolutionary.
exactly. And then half the time I'd just be like, you know what? I see a small 1 pixel gap between the edge of the GIF and the table itself. And you're like, is my GIF not exported properly? Like, is there some like, like anti-aliasing going on? Or I'm just gonna say the table with like 0 pixels, let's just squish it as much as I can just to make this work.
Yeah, like it's silly. We don't think how things were like 10 or 20 years ago, but CSS and web development has gone really far. And yeah, the problems we had back in the day are ridiculous from this point of view.
Yeah.
Just transparent PNGs were a challenge. I remember those.
No, I hear you. I mean, the nice thing is the demographic of this podcast are people around our age who actually have been there doing exactly this. They're going to be like, oh, I remember this exactly. All the new people watching, they're like, what? What's a table? You mean use tables for layout? What in the
Yeah,
world? If they're even writing code in the first place, they're all using like low code, no code tools like Webflow, and which actually are fantastic in many ways. So, good for them that they're able to, not have to learn some of the things that we had to learn to get to where we are, which I guess also means like, I never learned assembly or machine code, which a lot of people back then had to learn to get to programming. So, I think it's just the natural evolution of how things go.
yeah, of course.
Did you ever use any, like what you see is where you can get design tools for building your websites initially, or is it always manual?
I think I started with Dreamweaver.
Nice.
I'm not sure which version it was, but yeah, it was. It was really helpful to actually, if I remember it correctly, Anna. Uh, yeah, so you just drag and drop things inside, and I don't think it was working properly. So I always had to go into code, and eventually you just realize that yeah, this is not working at all like it should be. So you jump into code.
Yeah, I've admitted this a few times in the past, but I still use Dreamweaver even today. Like I
Yeah,
started my blog like in 1998, and I still kept at it since then. And of course, back then there was no CMS, there was no WordPress or anything like that. It was really all Apache and server-side includes for basic templating. And because I'm what I do is so content heavy, I just need a service, which is like just like a word editor. Just type in text, add images, and FTP it up to a location. And I do see though progressively every couple of years the quality gets worse and worse because Dreamweaver right now doesn't support CSS custom properties, for example, right? So
yeah,
everything is like I'm editing in Times New Roman because even using custom properties for everything, it's not working. But there's going to come a point though where we're going to have to like move to the at least a modern decade. I'm actually a century behind if you look at it from like 1900, 19th, 20th century, 21st century. So no, Dreamweaver is actually great. I started off with Netscape Composer, which came free with the Netscape browser, and then switched to Front Page Express, which came free with Internet Explorer, and then went
okay.
from there. But no, that's actually really cool. Like starting from that tool and like realizing that the quality of what it's creating isn't exactly what I would need because there are limitations to what tools can do in the abstract way of programming language, like HTML. So yeah.
Yeah, but it's good to have those tools because I think it actually can help you get started easier, or at least a little bit easier. At least that's my perspective. I even, in terms of JavaScript, I started with jQuery because JavaScript back in the day also incredibly challenging. I just remember writing an HTTP request, like Ajax request, that was like 20 or 30 lines of code. It's ridiculous. And then jQuery came and it's just one line and it does what it needs to do. And you don't have to worry about how this is what I need to do for Internet Explorer. This is what I need to do for modern browser or whatever. And yeah, so tools like that can help you get into things. But once you start seeing limitations, then you really need to dig into layer below into actual code.
Did you ever stop on the PHP bandwagon for a bit as well, or were you completely avoiding that?
Yeah, I did. I did. Uh, I'm not sure at what point that was. I think after design, I think I wanted to go into PHP, so I started digging into that area, and then eventually moved to front end. But also challenging thing, I was on Windows back in the day, and just setting up a server for PHP so I can work that was so frustrating. It's
Yes.
incredible. And then tools like XAMPP and WAMP, I think, if their names. Yeah, then those tools came and it just became, okay, this is not an issue anymore.
Yeah, WAMP was like the Windows, Apache, MySQL, PHP like stack. You install a gigantic installer, you restart your machine, and then magically things work. I have no idea how it works, but it works.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
nice, 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 nice. And so, in looking at the work that you do, you run CSS Weekly, a really popular newsletter. We talk about CSS tricks, but on the other hand, you also write a lot about marketing and content creation and that world as well. And so, what do you spend most of your time on? What are you most passionate about when it comes to like both those topics?
Yeah, I used to do a lot more of different things before, and now I'm just almost exclusively focused on CSS Weekly, actually. So yeah, I guess this is my current focus. But I'm always interested in other things as well. So it's just it comes and goes, and CSS is my priority right now, or CSS Weekly rather. But yeah, I'm also always reading about like marketing and thinking about that stuff. So I think it's very interesting if you have the ability to go into different areas, into different subjects, and then oftentimes you can transfer knowledge from one area to another. At least it is with marketing. Like if you're good at marketing, it's going to help you be a better developer because it will help you market yourself better to potential employers. Or if you have a blog or newsletter like I do, it also helps with that. So all those things are kind of can tie actually nicely together.
No, yeah, I agree. The skills are very much intertwined, especially how do you get people to notice something you're building, especially today when there's so much quality content out there. How do you stand out in so many ways? Do you feel the tension that on one hand, you've been doing your series weekly for quite some time. On the other hand, you're like, oh, this really great marketing thing I really want to share with people, but the audience I have is not going to be interested in it. I still need to shared somehow. Do you ever have that tension, and how do you work through that?
Well, I actually don't think about that a lot. I just share what I want to share, and then if there's audience for that, great. If not, well, maybe people come, maybe a little bit, maybe audience grows a little bit uh, time from time or after some time when I'm doing stuff. But yeah, I guess it's about me wanting to do things, and then if it resonates with people, great. If not, I guess I'm learning something from putting the content out there, even if nobody reads it. Let's call it that way. Even just with CSS Weekly standpoint, I was working on a newsletter which is a curated content, and now like a year ago, a bit more, I started doing YouTube channel, which with original content, and also the switch from that with the same audience, like people who care about CSS, is just get them to think of me not just as a curator but also as creator. That's more challenging than I thought it would be. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you. When I went, switched from like both doing articles in text form, but also doing videos, huge shift. And for various reasons, people like the videos a lot more than I like the articles. And I'm like, no, I like writing. This is what I really care about. Read the content more. Watch less of the videos. Read the content. And it's always tricky. The way I would say to describe it is like it's like acrobats in the circus. When they're like jumping from like one ledge to another ledge, right? Right
Yeah.
now, if I had to describe like a lot of what you describe right now, is like CSS is the top of the funnel. It's like CSS is what they care about. You have articles, you have videos, and so on. And then sometimes you have ideas around like, oh, I want to actually talk about marketing. I want to talk about like how do you be more happy in your career, yourself, more fulfilling, and so on. That does not fit under the CSS bucket. So you create one more rung over there, and then you're like, do I have people just jump that rung on a one-off basis, or do I reorient everything I'm doing on that one rung where it's like the content here, it's all about Zoran. It's not about CSS. It's not about this. But then subset of that will be CSS, a little bit of marketing, a little bit of like, fulfillment and so on. And that's something I've talked to a lot of content creators where they often have this struggle, especially if they've been doing content creation for a very long time, because as humans, as people, we evolve as well. What I was doing 20 years ago, where I'm like just sitting around like playing with code. I'm like, oh, I can't wait to share how I'm doing this. It's very different now where my day job, so I'm a product manager, and I deal with like, that kind of a thing 90% of the time when I mentor and teach people on exactly the same topic. But because I've carried over that world from like so many years ago, I'm like, I still spend time to program and explain it, but it's different. That I'm like running at half efficiency because half my brain is like doing this other stuff and the other half is talking about this. And I used to grow up and like I share everything I'm doing. It's 100% what I do. I share, but now it's all bifurcated. And so that's something I always run into, and I'm curious to see how you navigate that if you are worried about that at all.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I'm trying not to think about that. Like right now, I'm viewing myself as I'm going to work on CSS and CSS Weekly, and then if I have time or need, basically it's a need when you have to put some content out there, then I do it, and whatever. I'm not really worried if anybody's going to read it or not.
Nice.
If it's not related to CSS, at least from that perspective, right?
Well,
It's,
I think your other content is also fantastic, by the way.
it's
So,
always somewhere in the back of the mind. I want to do more of that. I would like more people to read it. But,
yeah,
realize it's too much. It's just even working on one thing can be exhausting. Like if you
yeah,
want to.
even doing it weekly can be absolutely exhausting, because you're like, oh, it's 7 days, it's like, but no, those seven, doing it on a clockwork, takes discipline, takes effort. And so, I do want to get back a little bit on this one because, so what, teaching and explaining to people, that's a very different skill. And it's a great skill as well. I'm always like happy when people share their knowledge. What made you start wanting to educate people on CSS?
Well, first, my motivation is intrinsic, so I wanted to get better at presenting. I wanted to get better at explaining things, and well, when you explain things, you learn better yourself. So this is like the first main motivation, and well, it just ties with the things that I was doing before, helping people stay up to date with CSS, right? So yeah, that's why I started a YouTube in that particular area of content, right? And I guess it makes a lot of sense when I'm thinking about it in this way. Whenever I do something, I've tried to find something that is that's gonna make me that's gonna be intrinsically motivated and not extrinsically. I'm not looking for views. I'm looking what I can get out of it in terms of I can grow, I can learn, and those are the most important things that I get either from starting a newsletter or a YouTube channel like that. So yeah, that's where I come from.
At what point did you realize that you were onto something big here with the newsletter? Because, I checked out issue number one, and the format was almost very similar in some ways. You had a lot of curated content, and it gradually increased into more of your own content where you decided to like share more of your tips and tricks. But for the most part, though, you had a winning formula at the beginning, and you continue to have that same formula that is carrying through at the end. And that's actually very rare to see there. So how did you know that you had it figured out?
Well, the point where I knew is when Leah Barrow shared my newsletter, which was I think like in issue 1 or 2, and then just people started coming in because I take a lot of time to go through as much content related to CSS as possible, and I only include the best stuff in the newsletter. So you're always going to see 7 links in the newsletter and no more than that, because I want people to have like, okay, if I read those articles this week, or if I watch those videos, whatever it's in the newsletter, then I'm going to be up to date and I don't have to worry about, following dozens and dozens of other sources on social media or RSS or whatever. And my lucky thing was that I started before a lot of other before others. So there was like HTML5 weekly, JavaScript weekly, I think it was web design weekly, and somewhere around that time I started my newsletter. So it was still all fresh. Like starting the newsletter right now is it's very saturated and it's probably very difficult to get into it, especially in a format like I have where I just share other people's work. But back in the day, I think that was quite a bit valuable. And I was just riding that wave until now. So people still find it valuable, people still care about it. So it seems to be working still.
No, that's fantastic. And how do you come up with the topics you want to focus a particular week's content on around?
Uh, I I don't. I just take the fresh stuff, like whatever was published in the last week or so. If it's good enough, it goes into newsletter. I never create a specifically topic newsletter like this is going to be about accessibility or this is going to be about whatever grid, CSS grid or whatever. I don't do that. I just share the latest content people created. And yeah, now that I mentioned accessibility, I always try to include at least one accessibility related article in the newsletter because I think that it's a topic that's really important and that people probably overlook way too often.
And do you get feedback from individuals saying like, "Oh, can you cover this particular topic?" Or have you found certain topics to just resonate more with the audience than not?
You mean like for my content that I'm creating?
Yeah, for your CSS content, exactly.
Oh yeah. I started getting that like on YouTube, like in the comments, like something that will be related to the video that I just did. Like, oh, can you talk a little bit more about, I don't know, images, something like that. So it's the more the more audience watches my videos, the more feedback I get in this direction. So yeah, it started happening. But
Nice.
yeah.
As part of posting weekly, how do you come up with that cadence that you want to do it weekly as opposed to monthly or every couple of days or random that this may be?
I think newsletters that were inspiration were also weekly, like JavaScript weekly and HTML5 weekly, and it just makes a lot of sense because there's so much things happening in our web development space that doing it less often would be, I think, maybe too little, and doing it more often would be just overwhelming for people. So weekly for me makes sense. And again, from my perspective, the weekly in the name forces me to actually do it every week. Because if I just had CSS content, then I wouldn't have like this specific need to every week there needs to be a newsletter because it's in the name.
Okay.
So
Yes.
it's kind of forcing you to actually do the stuff when you lose motivation, when life gets in the way or something like that.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you on it. So you spend like, life gets in the way, for example. In your case, you also, balance doing all to the side with also like a professional day job as well. So how do you find the time to balance?
Yeah, I don't. I'm actually working full time on CSSWeekly now for a year or something like that. But before that, it was quite a bit challenging. But I had a very good employer that was willing to give me a portion of the company time basically to work on the newsletter. So that was really nice thing to have. But still, it just I got into a point where it became overwhelming. So either I'm going to focus on career and just put the newsletter on the site, whether it goes or not, who cares? Or I'm just going to focus on that and see if I can make it, if I can make a living out of it. And yeah, it's working out for now. So it's I've been really happy with that.
Yeah, that's always the biggest challenge content creators often come up with is like I think the power law applies in almost all industries, but especially in content creation, where if you want to shift from what you're doing right now to something that can actually sustain a basic level of living, that's a huge jump. And you can look at like how much content creators out there are actually able to make that leap successfully, so that you were able to make it actually quite impressive.
Well, yeah, I think that the challenge is you have to take a step back. Like no matter how you put it, if you're making this much from the newsletter and this much for your day job, if you quit your day job, the newsletter is not going to just grow significantly to cover that difference immediately, right? So you just, yeah, you take a step back, and if it works out, fine. If not, well, you can always get a new job. Luckily, we live in an industry where developers are sought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think the other thing that a lot of people underestimate is just the amount of work and effort it takes in creating content. You know, on one hand, it's like, oh, if I just have like 8 more hours a day available to me, I'll be able to create more content. I'm like, it's not doesn't exactly work that way, because content creation is very much a creative process, and it's very hard to predict how when your brain's going to be like, oh, I'm inspired to do this. And just having more time does not mean that you'll be 8 times more productive at this point. It might be like half as productive, because the inspiration, the ruts you might mentally get yourself out of by having something you're doing on the side, or as formally as part of your employer's work, where you're like, oh, that jogged an interesting idea that I'm going to not jot down and write about it later. Those sources of inspiration and like little forcing functions oftentimes aren't caused by having more time. Actually, having less time, that stress of that might actually inspire you more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I try to view as inspiration from perspective of what Seth Godin, going back to marketing, what he teaches, and that is like you don't wait for inspiration. If you're a professional, you open the computer and you start doing the work, and inspiration is gonna come or not, but you have to do the work. And this is the approach I take. But like you mentioned, there's a lot of challenges with that as well, and like it's very difficult for me, for at least for now, to plan my content precisely, because sometimes I dig into the topic and I try to, like, this is going to be video that I'm going to record next, and then I spend whatever, like 5 hours researching that, learning about that, and then I realize, okay, this is not good enough for a video. There's not enough meat there. I can't do this. This is not going to work. And then you have to jump to another topic, and then the timeline shifts, and the video is not there, and you dig into a different topic. But like you say, it's a creative work, so this is like a part of a job. You never know if it's gonna work or not, but yeah, you have to figure it out.
Yeah, it's always a fun part. You know, I do enjoy the ambiguity that revolves around content creation. And every single day is going to be very different. And you know, one of the things that I often find with content creators is that there's always this pressure to create content that's almost perfect, which in many cases goes against being able to publish or get content out in a timely manner. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I had a very big challenge with that, and I did, like, I think it was 2 years ago on my personal blog. I did like a challenge for myself. I'm gonna publish something every day, and like this forces you to actually stop caring about that, if it's good enough or if it's not good enough. And the thing that I said right now is just sometimes you realize that when you're talking about technical stuff, that you cannot present it this way, and then you have to switch. But for me, I'm not happy with no, I'm not happy with any of my videos that I created until now. Like everyone, if I look at it, it's, oh, this is horrible, you know. And also, English is not my first language, so I also have challenges with that. So I re-record different parts plenty of times, and it just takes a lot of time to get it into decent state so I can publish it. It's never perfect. It's never going to be perfect. But yeah, like you said, this is the challenge that content creators face. And well, eventually we have to say, okay, this is good enough now, and I'm going to just put it out there, whatever. And and beautiful thing is that people don't really care about those little imperfections that you notice so badly.
Exactly right. You know, because on one hand, it's like they are wanting to learn something, and when they were in person, like, let's say they meet you in real life and like, I want some help in this case, right? I need to explain it to them. There's no editing, there's no like, going back and being like, let me adjust the background a bit, or like, the wording here, so let me go back and like, re-edit it. It's going to be like exactly the way it's going to be in real life. And there's an expectation that's like, yeah, this is just an individual who's sharing his time and making this work. And I think people recognize that and they appreciate a lot more of that. And oftentimes they're probably like not even focusing on those little imperfections. They're probably working on like, oh, I'm trying to get this code written, like, oh, that's exactly what I care about. They're probably in their own mind, they're probably having their own narrative of like, reinterpreting what you're saying anyway. They never actually notice what you're saying there. And that's very much the case. So what got you started into creating videos? Because the videos is fairly a new thing. Like, you haven't had videos for a long time, and then you started it maybe about a year or so ago.
Yeah, yeah. I think I already mentioned it. I wanted to get better at presenting, at teaching, and I find the video to be very interesting content, or actually medium. So I wanted to learn more about that myself, and that's why I got into video. I probably myself, I like reading articles more than I like watching videos, which is a very interesting thing. But from perspective of me trying to learn something and trying to get better as a professional, I think that getting better at video is probably more important. It's even not just in like YouTube, but also in like in real life, like presenting at the conferences or something like that. This is something that I would like to try and like to see if I can, yeah, become better at it than I currently am. And this is all just part of that effort. And with remote work being more and more popular, I think that also it's a lot of value to be able to speak to a screen, to actually speak to you right now,
Exactly.
or a video, because this doesn't come so naturally always.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you. It's that's one of the things that got me interested in videos as well in many ways, is that so much of your time is spent communicating. This is before COVID, but still, like, so much of your time spent communicating. And unless you watch yourself, record yourself, and you watch yourself afterwards, you're like, oh my gosh, is this how I sound like when I'm explaining a concept? And those little things that you start fixing about yourself, like you mentioned, also pays dividends in the real world or in any activity that you do, because a large part of it is still down like what our day-to-day jobs and things are like, is we take complicated ideas, we simplify it down, and then we adjust the level of detail based on the audience we're speaking to. If you're speaking to someone very technical, we're able to go very deep. If you're speaking to someone at a very high level, we're able to communicate to them in a way that naturally resonates with what they care about. And that's a skill that takes practice. And I think a lot of people don't often get the opportunity to do that. And recording videos is one of the best ways, because at that point, you're actually watching yourself navigate those exact same things, and you get to learn from your own mistakes and then improve it, and then ultimately get more natural at it.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. It's exactly what it is.
So I also like to ask this question because it's always curious, because what tools do you use to record your videos?
I'm using ScreenFlow, so I'm using it for recording and for editing.
Yep. I use ScreenFlow as well, and not too many people know about that. Like, everyone uses Camtasia, or they use like like the big one from that area, but ScreenFlow is fantastic. And I think the best thing about it is really the performance. When I'm editing, when I'm exporting something, for example, it happens in a few minutes. The quality is as good as like a 45-minute export from Camtasia that went like MP4 as well. And it's little things like that. I'm like, these are the things that make video editing painful in some ways, but tools like ScreenFlow are fantastic at solving it.
Yeah, I think I was looking into different tools as well, like DaVinci Resolve is what people were recommending as well. And well, there's other tools like Adobe Premiere or something like that, but those are really expensive, at least from my perspective. And yeah, like just ScreenFlow makes a lot of sense. It's very simple, and I actually don't even want a lot of complicated effects or anything like that. I want people to focus on things that I'm saying on the screen that I'm showing, and not on editing or flashy things. So yeah, it just makes a lot of sense.
That's the part that we touched upon earlier, noted down here to kind of come back to, is that your interest was in design, and then you started learning CSS and things like that. But in reality, at least what I found from many people, is that learning CSS, learning programming, learning these things is not what they really care about. What they really care about is getting their design out the door. It's like, I have this idea, I want to share it. Or in this case, I have like a newsletter, I have some ideas I want to share, I'm going to get it out the door. So the tools and the ways of getting it are just like interruptions I need to get along the way that I need to understand, because if I don't understand these tools, I can't get my ideas out. And
Yeah.
your explanation right now of like videos and like screen flow and like editing, yeah, a lot of people, tell me, yeah, you must use Adobe, Premiere because it's the best tool for it. I'm like, why? These tools do a good enough job. Yes, I can create probably nicer animations. I can probably do some like different filters and so on. But that any time I spend doing that is less time I can spend doing what I really care about, just creating content and sharing my ideas with the world. So what I'm really looking for is like, what is the fastest time to market? To use a business term, on like, I have an idea. What's the fastest way to get there? I don't care what the tools are. If I'm using Dreamweaver, I'm not proud that I'm using Dreamweaver, even like 20 years since I started, but it gets the job done, and no one who's consuming the content will ever care that the HTML was created using these. Like, okay, the Lighthouse score is good. Great. No one cares how it was actually built. I think oftentimes that gets lost with a lot of content creators. So I'm like talking to them like, oh, how much, what did you create today? Or what's going on? He's like, oh, I'm fiddling with this thing right here. And I'm like, well, if you enjoy fiddling with something, by all means, go for it. It's great to learn something that's the craft, the skill that you need to learn. But if your goal is to do something to actually share it with the world, and you're basically doing this and you're not really enjoying it, then you should probably revisit why you're doing some of this.
Yeah, I agree. I have exactly the same mindset. And one example is I'm using WordPress for my blog, even for CSS Weekly. Our website is on WordPress, some older version, because yeah, it doesn't matter what's behind it. As long as I can, as quickly as possible, create what I want, then it's great. But a lot of developers that I talk to, like, I want to create a blog, I want to publish articles or something like that, and then they start by, okay, I'm going to create a custom blog on whatever platform currently is very popular, and then I'm going to rewrite everything. And then they do that. They have a big fancy launch. They publish one or two articles, and then that's that for this for this year or for next year. And then a new framework comes along. I'm going to learn that. So I rewrite my blog from scratch, and I'm going to publish one article. Like you say, it's great if you want to learn about this new platform, but it has nothing to do with content creation, right? You want
Exactly.
to, if you want to,
Yeah, and I think you wrote about this in front of your newsletter as well. Is like just how our brain, processes, success and satisfaction in some ways. People often say like you don't have pre-announce, you did something great, because when you did that, your brain is like, okay, great, I'm done. Like I'm not going to do any more. I've already done it. And I find that this is often a similar case where it's like, like I love Astro. It's like a framework that's really popular, and they have a nice blogging, there's static site generation, all these things. But if my goal is like, oh, I'm going to learn Astro, I'm going to publish it. I'm like, oh, great, my first blog post out on Astro. Too many things kind of get conflated. I'm like, great, it's successful. Got learned Astro, got it out the door. Then my brain is like, that's it. You're done. You're good to go now. I'll figure out something else to do. I'm like, that's not the goal here. It should be like, how do I keep motivating myself to create content? And so in your case, how do you keep motivating yourself despite so many cool things happening around the world?
I guess it's my job. One of a great motivation for the newsletter is when you have a sponsor. Even if you just get like whatever at the beginning, or maybe $20 from a sponsor, then you feel pressure. All right, I've sold something. I need to deliver on that, so it has to go out. So this is a really helpful for motivation. But other things that, like I already mentioned, it just has to come from inside, right? It has to be something that is not external. I'm going to learn something. I want to stay up to date with CSS. So having a newsletter, I'm going to read those articles anyway. It's just putting it together for other people to read is just like a bonus, like on layer on top of that.
Yeah. No, the having a sponsor one is always key, because whenever people ask me, what is your way of making sure that I can keep doing this? It's like, you need something real. You need someone who's depending on what you're doing. And when you're writing content, you get a lot of visitors, you get to see all these things, but it's all abstract. It's a number that you don't actually see a human being that's like actually looking at this and doing this. No one's gonna, basically be like, hey, Zoran, where's your newsletter? It hasn't come out. I mean, people will say now you're popular enough where that, in a week it doesn't happen. They're gonna ask like what's going on. But early on, it's not going to be that case. But a sponsor, though, they're going to ask because they gave you some. There's a transaction there. They gave you something in return. They expect something from you, and so in your mind, it's like, okay, this is definitely a thing where the pressure I need to get my brain into gear to make this work has to happen. Otherwise, I just don't want to disappoint someone who might be a long-term business contact and I want to, keep in a good, relationship with. And so that always is like a fantastic way of being able to do this.
Yeah, and what people don't realize, I think, is that you can actually artificially create that for yourself. You can make a bet with a friend, like I'm going to publish every week or whatever your cadence is, and then if I don't do that, I'm going to pay you whatever, like symbolic price, $10. and this is gonna put a lot of pressure on you. This artificial pressure that you can get from a sponsor, for example, and it's gonna help you with motivation.
Oh, that's a fantastic idea. I should probably try some of that because, I'm pretty sure like, your friends and my friends as well are going to be a lot more, less forgiving of you if you don't follow through on what you're doing, in so many nice ways, whether it's like, making fun of you and all the in ways that they know that motivates you because they know how you process information. So that's a great idea. So many.
Yeah. But
So,
again, it just has to come from the person. If you're doing it for the right, or that person that wants that motivation, if they don't want to do that, then nothing you create is going to make them do that. So if you don't have this need to put something out there, to create content, to write articles or whatever, then yeah, it's just nothing's going to work. But
yeah, no, it is a luxury though. Like I often, think about like so many people out there who have to do a job because they just have to, and that's not what they're passionate about. I'm always imagining going like, we lucked out in so many ways of being able to be in an industry and being have the right skills and the motivate and the mindset as well to like basically be able to be like, this is what I enjoy doing. Here's how I see a path to taking what I enjoy and making it beneficial for a lot of people, and then indirectly figuring out ways of being able to monetize it. That's actually quite a thing.
yeah, it's incredible privilege to be in this position. Like everywhere you look around, if you're not in web development space, it's just people being frustrated with their jobs. I have to go to work. I have to do this. Now I have to do that. And yeah, there certainly, or a lot of people just aren't passionate about what they need to do to make ends meet. And most of the developers that I know just are really passionate about web development, and they would probably do it even if they wouldn't be paid for that, like I would, right?
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
incredible privilege. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a bit. Let's go back to CSS. You've seen CSS changing quite a lot. We started off talking about we did CSS back when tables were like the norm for layout, and then cross-browser issues made divs and all that stuff like painful for a very long time to get to. And then the last like 5, 6 years, this things seem to like gotten a rocket ship and just gotten like extremely good from like which are layouts, which are animation techniques, and things that you probably were like, what took the world so long to get to this spot? And so what are some of the most interesting things you've seen changing in CSS that you were personally excited about?
I think I was most excited about has pseudo class as like a parent selector. We were asking about that for God knows how long time,
Yeah.
and it was always that's not possible to do in the browser engines, and now they figured it out. And I don't know, this is the one that sticks with me. But what I really like is that there's so much things happening, and they're not like flashy things like we get border radius or something like that. We get really tools that help you build better websites or help you create layout easier, like CSS Grid that we got. And it's just incredible where CSS is going these days. And now more and more it actually looks like a programming language, because those new properties that you have, like, you really have to dig into it to understand exactly what's happening and how to create exactly what you want. So it's really exciting. And yeah, it puts a lot of pressure on developers to stay up to date with everything that's happening. And it's pretty much impossible, I think. Like the best way for people to stay up to date is, well, other than reading my newsletter, is to, of course, do things. And then when you find a certain challenge, you're going to remember that you read something about it, and then you dig into it and do stuff and learn about the concept that you wanted to do. This is what I used to do when I had like a front-end developer job. Whenever I faced a certain challenge, I would remember, okay, I read something about this concept, so I'm going to try to implement that right now. And I wouldn't necessarily go immediately into certain concept or certain properties or whatever when I stumbled upon them. But when I need them, then okay, I know that there is something about that, so I'm gonna dig into it right now and see if it can help me solve my problem.
Yep. And I think another nice thing that's also happened, I think it's actually really cool, is that the speed at which features are introduced and adopted by all the major browsers has gotten really good. I mean, historically, always been a case where Internet Explorer was the one that took the longest time. And I was at Microsoft, I was a product manager on that team. So, I fully, recognize the challenges there of, seeing that firsthand. But I think now that most browsers are either on the Chromium engine or on the Firefox engine or on Safaris, makes it a little easier where there's a certain level of alignment between those three browser vendors that we want to make these things happen because it benefits our audience almost immediately. And so seeing things like, the funny thing also about a lot of the CSS techniques and so on is that it's almost like indirectly we all have this like psychic connection, or like this week this is a thing we're all going to be like focusing on, because independently, you wrote about OKLCH in one of your latest articles. A few hours before your article came out, I sent one on OKLCH to like my newsletter subscribers, as well. And then so Smashing Magazine did one a couple of days later. I'm like, none of us ever coordinated on this stuff, but it just so happened that we all decided to write about color, and OKLCH as a color format. And it just was like the perfect timing for it. And like you mentioned, border radius, cool, and all these things, but these are like really huge, practical, major changes in how we end up doing stuff.
Yeah, it's been incredible, at least in the last couple of years. Like CSS has gone so far, and it's still happening. Like we're getting new fantastic features almost every week. So
speaking of programming, you mentioned like it's becoming more of a programming language. Have you played with Houdini?
I did not.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It uses a combination like web workers and JavaScript in a CSS syntax to then create like these zigzaggy lines and blobs and things like that. It's that's something for you to like look into, because that's like the next generation of where CSS really goes into, because you always had Canvas, which was very JavaScript heavy and was not resolution independent. So you had to like, do scale stuff for Retina, and you had to do all these like, things to make things work really well. Then if we had SVGs, of course, which were like fantastic, they were great, but SVGs were kind of clunky to work with. It's still about JavaScript to do things in the DOM. But now there's like in between world where now in CSS, I just like, write a normal selector, I say background color, and instead of specifying a color, I pass in this value of this like little JavaScript thing that like does its own world of magic in my view. And then you have like nice blobs and like various shapes going. I'm like, wow, what is this? Like, how did that like it's almost like we got one more layer of something to fully understand, because when we simplify it, right, it's always like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, great, but there's actually more to it though, right? Then you have like WebAssembly, you have WebGL, and you have like Canvas, and now you have this whole new world. So it's like, yeah, but then you have like, it's actually 8 different things that you could potentially mix and match to make this work. So it's almost like Duplos or Legos or this combination of things, which is like makes this whole world look really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that you mention it, Houdini is definitely on my list to dig into. So at one point I will jump into it and create something around that, but I still haven't. There's just too much stuff happening and a little time to cover everything.
Exactly. When Grid and Flexbox came out, how big of a change was it for your world?
Oh, massive. I think that I don't even remember right now, and so I'm thinking about it, how challenging it was to create a complicated layout just using floats. Like
Oh goodness, yes.
that's just from this perspective, that's ridiculous. But yeah, so those tools really help you do things faster and actually more reliable, better. So yeah, that was like things that you mentioned, Flexbox and Grid. Yeah, those are probably the biggest features that I would say that came to CSS that make the language jump forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably one of the world's top CSS experts. I've seen your content. I've been following you for some time on this. When you're creating a layout, when you're designing something, how do you do it? I've spoken to other people who are like, done CSS for a very long time. They all say the same thing. They bring up the dev tools, they just type in random stuff to see does this work or not. Is that reflect how you do things as well, or are you more, more like precise in how you try this out?
No, oftentimes it looks exactly like that, or at least it used to. Now that I dig into every concept specifically, then I learn about it as much as I can and understand better what's happening and why I'm doing certain things. But a little while ago, while I was not focusing so much time on learning about those concepts and tools, it would just always be, okay, I'm just going to open developer tools. I'm going to play around with it until I get exactly the result I want, like you say. But yeah, I think you do that a couple of times and then you realize, okay, what am I doing here and why it's taking so long? I'm going to dig into it and understand exactly what align items and what justify items mean and why am I always confusing those two, for example. And yeah, so I guess it's you try to do things, and if it works out, great. But once you do them a little bit more often, once you repeat some certain things and you realize that you don't understand what's happening behind the scenes, or that you're actually losing a lot of time just trying to make something work, then you dig into it, you try to read about it a little bit more, and you understand, okay, this is what I was missing all the time, and this is how I, yeah, create exactly what I wanted to create. And this is just not related to this particular time. I had this similar experience years ago when I was starting out. Like, I was starting with CSS, I was just playing around with values, trying different things, and then I picked up some book about CSS. I don't remember what it was, but I just took my knowledge to the next level, because now I'm not no longer just playing with things. I'm actually understanding why are things happening. But I think that the step here is you have to play with things before you can actually think about concepts behind them. Because I think it's too challenging to just pick up and read technical specification about CSS Grid if you're not just playing around with it to see what's possible.
Yeah, and I also wonder how much of just the language itself makes it easy for you to do this, because if you ever learn another language, like let's say Java or C Sharp or something like that, you don't do that. You don't ever just like type in something randomly and try something out. Partly because the tool will tell you very quickly, your IDE is going to be like, this is wrong, you're missing, this kind of syntax. The other part is, depending on the complexity of your app, there's a whole compilation step. It takes like, 3, 4, 5 seconds for you to do that. That doesn't seem like a long number of time, but if you're in the flow, if you're actually typing something in, that's a lifetime. So you never get the satisfaction of like trying something quickly and being able to go. So in your mind, you're like, okay, I don't want to waste 5 seconds. Let me really make sure what I'm typing here truly makes sense. Whereas with CSS, first, you don't get, I call it like, there are no seatbelts. You have no idea if what you're typing is valid or invalid. There's no like little warnings you get. In the Chrome Dev Tools, the line just gets either ignored or you get a little warning icon if you're lucky, but 90% of the line just gets ignored. I'm like, wait, I just typed this gigantic string and it disappeared. What's going on here, right? And so you often are like, I'm just going to keep trying things. I'm just going to keep throwing things at the wall. One of them is bound to work because there is no delta between me trying something out and knowing something failed. And so there's no harm in just like this basically just guessing. And then eventually, one of the million things I'm going to try is bound to work out. Great. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to try to remember it. I'm going to forget it anyway. Like even now, when I have to type in like the format for like, defining a grid, there are like 18 different ways of defining a grid. It's like you can use template areas. You can use specific columns and rows separately. You can use it weird syntax or literally drawing in ASCII text your rows and columns. And I'm like, I got no idea what's going on. I'm just going to go to MDN, copy and paste something, modify things the best I can. And I want to forget it, but it's okay though. At least I know the process or what to search for. That's one of the things I always loved about CSS and also hated about CSS at the same time. It's just so difficult in so many ways.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and it's very close to my experience as well. And yeah, now that you mention it, like this build step process that I'm sorry, that you usually have, it just adds a lot of delay and a lot of frustration. At least it did for me. Like if you create something and you have to wait, even if it's 2 seconds for it to compile, so you can test it out in browser, there's just so much time you're losing in the course of the day if you're just trying to do stuff and then refreshing the browser. When CSS, that's entirely different because you see results immediately, and yeah, then you're not really thinking about how much time am I wasting just playing around with this instead of taking 50 minutes here to read how exactly this works so I can create it now, and possibly I'm gonna have to read it one more time, probably 2 more times to remember it exactly, but I'm gonna save a lot of time and a lot of frustration for myself if I learn about it properly.
Yeah, that's one of the things I actually really enjoy about watching this industry. You've probably seen it as well from having been in this area for so long. It almost felt like in the early days of the web and the programming and languages we came up with, there's this heavy influence of traditional programming language experts and traditional programming languages that try to impose how the web technology should evolve. The standards bodies did a good job trying to keep things at bay, but there's this heavy influence from the Java community and the more managed code community where you did all these things. And then now what we're seeing though is that as web developers, I think web developers are like the largest single group of developers I think at this point. There's like 19 or 20 million developers out there who identify as web developers, JavaScript, HTML, CSS. And so now they're influencing more traditional languages in areas where like, yeah, this is how things should be. Like, why is there a long compilation step and things like that? And you're seeing that today, if you look at, for example, we talked about PHP earlier. And the thing that I always loved about PHP is that once you got everything set up, you make a change, you save it, it's live. There's no like compilation came later. In later versions of PHP, you had like compilation and things like that, but it wasn't always the default. So memory wasn't great, performance wasn't great. But hey, you're doing the server, the end user can't see the password or your MySQL connection string with their username and password. I think the only reason people use PHP was just basically to prevent someone from going to view source, seeing the username and password you use for accessing all these things. They figured out how to solve that. No one probably used like server-side technology. But then what happened was it took like minutes to like maybe even like 10 minutes to deploy something to like a major server. Like let's say you're building a cloud function or a cloud service, it takes time to go to AWS or to GCP or Azure and things like that. And now what we're seeing with like services like Vercel or even AWS Lambda, it's like, yeah, you're writing something that goes on the server, but within 1 second, it's completely there. And you go back in the history of the people who created it, they all were inspired by like web development technologies. And they're like, yeah, why can't we get the nice things there? And the most example of this is if you read about the Swift language, the one that Apple came up with, maybe like well, actually about 5-6 years ago, maybe even longer at this point. But some of the motivations behind that language designer was really about taking the best parts of web development, the dynamically typed language, like up with Java. They always say dynamically typed languages, but they really mean JavaScript at the end of the day. Like, yes, Python exists, it's also really popular, but JavaScript is really the big one there. And it's nice to see that the pendulum swinging where a lot of things we like about this will hopefully carry over to all these other languages. And then we just keep benefiting from it, in other ways where like less and Sass and others kind of like come in to bring some formality and structure to CSS that might not have had before. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. And I think there was, maybe it was a joke or something when you mentioned PHP and Java. Like PHP was trying to become more like Java, and Java was trying to become more like PHP, and eventually we're gonna just reverse roles. So,
exactly. And then Cold Fusion came in from Macromedia, and you're like, what exactly is this Cold Fusion thing? And it seems to be like nice tooling, weird language syntax, but it's almost like Java server pages behind the scenes as well. But I'm glad, now the nice thing is that there's a billion solutions. They all meet a particular need, and if you like one, great, go for whichever one you happen to like. So we've been chatting for quite some time now. So I just want to ask, like, what's next for you? What's your next 5 years looking like?
that is very difficult to say. For right now, my goal is to stay in the CSS community and to help people stay up to date with CSS. I want to be in content creation as much as possible. At this point, I really like how YouTube is going, or at least video format, not necessarily YouTube. So I want to be doing more in that area, but we'll see where things take me. Like if it's going to make sense financially for me, then I'm going to continue doing that. If not, I'll try maybe something different. And who knows? I'm trying to be open to as many things as possible. Like I'm not trying to fix myself up. Okay, this is how I see my life. This is how I see my career or something. I want to be open and see, okay, like this is where I am now, but next step could be this. Maybe it could be this. Who knows? And I think that, yeah, this is exactly how I started. I never would have imagined myself as at the point where I am right now, but I'm really happy that I am here. At the time where I was starting programming, I was thinking about programming in, I think it was Delphi or something like that. And ridiculous, right? And yeah, and then I sort of, what thing happened kind of naturally and just replaced that. Like if I would just focus on the area or on the path that I wanted to take, I would never gotten where I am right now. So I'm not sure that even web development is going to be my main focus like 5 years from now. From this perspective, absolutely, but I'm open to anything. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, you're over 10 years in on CSS Weekly. While we were chatting, I went to my Gmail and I was like, when was the first CSS Weekly that I signed up for? It was actually, in 2013, like February or March of 2013. One of my friends pinged me and said, hey, this newsletter mentioned an article that you wrote on like introduction to animation, and I'm like, oh, cool, let me see this. And yeah, it was actually issue 46 is when, you mentioned, you linked to my blog and talked about like animation that I wrote, that I had content around. And then so that's when I started off with it. So I've been like, because so for me, it's like you're a regular stable in my inbox. Like every week I'm like, yeah, oh, that's just great. I see like see this weekly thing. But it wasn't until like maybe a month or so I'm like, wait a minute, this newsletter's been coming in almost every week on the dot for like as long as I can remember. Like like just you don't remember details like beyond like 5 years for the most part. So like 10 years, I'm like, let me just see who's behind this. And that's how I ran into you. And I'm like, holy crap, he's like creating videos. This is great. This is exactly the kind of person that thinks like who genuinely loves this stuff and would be fantastic to talk about because there's depth to what you're doing here. And that's why I was like, let's do this.
Thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate that.
All right, Zoran. Thank you again for talking to us. And you know what? We'll have to do this again some point because this keeps changing so much, and I think there might be some fun things to talk about in the future. Definitely, do play with Houdini, and we should chat more how your experience was with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to come back. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure seeing you in live and talking to you.
Cool. Wow, that was a blast.
Yeah.
No, hope you had a good time as well. I always, I always just enjoy like nerding out about some of these things as well because there aren't too many people who understand or care about these things to a level where it's like, yeah, it's just fun to talk about just like the old days, how things go, and then also the day-to-day details of the complexity of what is to create content.
No, absolutely. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and like we share a
But
lot of similar ideas.
I have a question for you. Have you ever thought about taking your content and turning it into a book?
Not at some point, I probably did, like from my personal blog, but other than that, no. It mean like CSS Weekly or
Yeah, this is weekly.
no, I did not.
Because the reason why I bring it up is that a lot of the content I create, I copy and paste into book form. And I tell my publishers, I'm basically like, what you're getting is free marketing, where the content I put on the website for free is going to be marketing for people who care about reading in a physical book form. And I got this idea when I realized that some people learn better from reading, some people learn better from watching videos, and some people genuinely like books. It's like having this like uninterrupted area where they can go somewhere, read something without worrying about Instagram notifications or tweet notifications, all these things. Like they enjoy that. So I'm like, how can I maximize content reuse without doing work multiple times? And one of the things that I liked about your content is that back in the day, right? I don't know if they still do this right now, but there would be like books that literally would come out every 6 months saying like volume 1 of like all the greatest things that happened. And I was big into Flash development community. That's how I got started in programming. So Friends of Ed would keep publishing books. So like, Flash Creativity, volume 1. 6 months later, Flash Creativity, volume 2. They made like 10 or 15 volumes where like, every version would be like it's a collection of things from different people that happened in that 6-month period. And I always loved that because it was still timely. And it was always interesting to see like how people did that. And every time I read your newsletter, I'm like, this is perfectly copy and pastable information where, when I read it like 6 months later, it is still going to be very much relevant. And you already have the content. And so it'd be a nice, interesting, like little booklet form that might come out of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for this idea. I'll look into it. I might do something like that.
Yeah, if you look into it and you think there's interest in it, I wrote my first book a long time ago when I was like very young, because I was blogging very young as well. And then I stopped for a long time because it was, not the most fun thing to do in the world. Then I started self-publishing, and that lowered the bar heavily. And then once I started self-publishing, I was then able to go to publish and say like, this is their books I'm self-publishing. This is the sales data that they have. I would love to actually be able to go into like physical bookstores and libraries and schools, which Amazon is not allowed in most places. Like, libraries cannot carry Amazon self-published books because they just don't like it. And so that gave me a lot of ability to be like, okay, I figured out what it takes to write a book end to end. So I know the details of it. And now when I'm working with a publisher, the whole process is much smoother in terms of it. So if you discover you're interested in that area, I'd be happy to make introductions, to publishers. Like I wrote my animation book, the one you linked to actually, right? I wrote for O'Reilly. I took all that content, published for O'Reilly and creating web animations. And now I work for Pearson on JavaScript, and I'm just wrapping a book on, I have a daughter now, she's like 5 years old. I'm like, what can I give her that she might one day be like, I really want to read this book? I'm like, what I had the most difficulty with like algorithms and data structures. If I had to write it for a 5-year-old, what would it be like? And so that's the book I wrote. So the book is almost done here. So I'm going to be, it's going to be published in a short bit. Again, all the content freely available on the website as well. But it's been a lot of fun actually, because I get so many emails from people going like, different parts of the world saying like, oh, my school library had this book and I read it. And I'm like, this really got me to a program. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. That's something I would not been able to do purely by just doing some of this. And the work on my end, very minimal, because the hard part was just creating the content in the first place. But that's why I just want to throw this idea out there. I think you have a lot of great content. I think I'll be very successful at doing that.
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that I want to explore still is to, like, every video that I record, I want to create maybe an article from that as well. Like I think that this could be nice because some people don't like watching videos without read it. So this is something that I intend to explore. But it never really occurred to me that like this content that I'm curating would actually be presentable in a book format. That just interesting.
Yeah. And creating a video and article is exactly what I do for almost all my content. It's like every content I create, because I create the artwork, I'm like all the ideas are already there. Now I need to put it into like slide form and present it.
Yeah.
The part that makes it more complicated now, of course, is like TikTok and like YouTube Shorts and so on, because YouTube is so heavily promoting YouTube Shorts, and it's kind of frustrating in some ways because they want more people to use that. And the format, you can't be more than 1 minute long, and it has to be like 16. The vertical portrait mode. And programming content is so difficult to communicate in that particular mode. And so I'm just like, okay, well, but this is what the world is going to. So I need to figure out a way to adapt it. So that's where the next set of challenge is going to be.
Yeah, I did a few shorts. I didn't really do a lot of them, but it's definitely interesting and definitely forces you to trim down everything that's not necessary and just, okay, this is what I want to show you. It's really cool.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
hear you.
it's, yeah, on one hand it's challenging, and on the other hand, if that's what people want, then yeah, like I'm sure I'm gonna try to teach you everything I can in 1 minute. Then, if that's what you want to see.
Yeah, I'm just hoping it's going to be an AI solution one day where it just basically knows. I mean, it's already good at like, kind of interpreting what we look like when we speak words and like, using our voice and all these things. So basically be like, okay, AI system, here's the video, full 16:9 widescreen. Do your magic, do what it takes, and just publish it to YouTube directly. Don't even show it to me, just publish it directly. That's what I'm really waiting for. And the thing is, I don't think we're that far away from it. I think we're probably maybe a few months away from having that, because just seeing the progress in like half my TikTok videos now that I occasionally see, I love history. And so half of them were just like, random 3D avatars explaining in a deep voice random historical concepts like from Wikipedia. I'm like, this is still very compelling. I will watch it. And so I can totally imagine that being translated into the CSS world.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. But I don't want to keep you for too long as well. I know it's like a Friday and it's like late, but
No,
yeah, it was great chatting with you. I think all the more reason I think we should probably do this again when there's like,
yeah,
more interesting, crazy stuff that happens, because I think it's a fun space. So looking forward to another 10 more years of your newsletter, by the way.
yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, I'll be happy to come back. It was
Cool.
really good talking to you. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I'll talk to you in a bit then. Bye.
Okay. Bye.